I'm Josephine, 32 female. I live in a small, minimalist apartment in a city far from where I grew up, a place I filled with plants and books to counter the stark white walls. By day, I'm a user experience designer, a job that involves making technology intuitive and humane, a stark contrast to my family life, which was anything but. For years, my family believed I was barely scraping by, a narrative they not only accepted but seemed to relish. This story is about the day that narrative shattered in the most public and humiliating way possible for them, all because they underestimated the useless dreamer they raised. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The words "useless dreamer" were the soundtrack to my childhood. My father, Gary, a man who measured success in commission checks and sales quotas, first branded me with the label when I was 10. I had spent an entire weekend building a detailed diorama of a fantasy world from my favorite book instead of practicing for my soccer tournament. D stared at the intricate, hand-painted clay figures and sighed, the sound heavy with disappointment. "Josephine," he'd said, his voice laced with a weary sort of pity, "pretty things don't pay the bills. You've got to be a winner, not a dreamer." That sentiment was echoed and amplified throughout my life. My older brother, Harry, a natural athlete and a carbon copy of my father in both ambition and demeanor, was the winner. He was the one who got the triumphant pats on the back, the new sports equipment, the car on his 16th birthday. His path was straightforward: sports, business school, and a lucrative career in sales, just like Dad. He moved through life with an unearned confidence, his success a foregone conclusion in our family's eyes. I, on the other hand, was the quiet, artistic one who preferred coding in my room to socializing, the one who saw the world in patterns and interfaces rather than profits and losses. My mother, Lydia, was a passive enabler of this dynamic. She loved me, I think, but her love was conditional, filtered through a deep-seated fear of her husband's disapproval. She would praise my drawings in hushed tones when he wasn't around but would quickly change the subject if he entered the room. "Your father just wants what's best for you, dear," she would say, which was her code for "don't rock the boat." Her primary role was to maintain the peace, even if it meant sacrificing my self-esteem at the altar of her husband's rigid expectations. The dynamic only worsened as I grew older. When I announced I was going to college to study computer science with a focus on human-computer interaction, my father was openly derisive. "So, you're going to make video games?" he scoffed over dinner. "How's that going to help you buy a house?" Harry snickered, adding, "Don't worry, Joe. You can always design the logo for my first dealership." They didn't understand what I did, and they had no interest in learning. To them, my passion was a frivolous hobby, a dead-end path that would inevitably lead me back to their doorstep, broke and begging for a real job. I tried to explain that I was designing the invisible architecture of the digital world, that my work was about empathy and efficiency, but their eyes would glaze over. It was easier for them to file it under Josephine's weird computer stuff and move on. The final straw came a few years after I graduated. I had been working for a small tech startup, putting in grueling hours for modest pay, but I was learning and growing. I was also working on a personal project in my spare time, an app designed to help freelance artists manage their projects and finances. It was a passion project, born from my own frustrations and a desire to help other dreamers. I made the mistake of mentioning it to my family during a holiday visit. "An app," my father repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Josephine, you're 24 years old. Harry just made partner at his firm. He's looking at buying a lake house. And you're making an app." "It's more than just an app, Dad," I tried to explain, my voice small. "It solves a real problem for a lot of people." "The only problem you should be solving is your own bank account," he retorted. "You can't even pay your own bills without a roommate. You've always been a useless dreamer, and you always will be." That was the day I emotionally checked out. I stopped trying to explain. I stopped trying to seek their approval. I smiled politely at family gatherings, gave vague, non-committal answers about my job, and poured every ounce of my energy into my work and my app. The startup I worked for was eventually acquired, and my stock options gave me a comfortable cushion. But the app was different. It took off in a way I never could have imagined. I sold it to a larger tech company for a sum of money that felt unreal. But I never told my family, not a word. My quiet life, my small apartment, my modest car, it was all a carefully constructed facade. I let them believe I was still the struggling artist, the dreamer who couldn't make ends meet. Their condescension was a constant, dull ache, but it was also my shield. Their ignorance was my peace. It allowed me to build a life on my own terms, free from their judgment and their inevitable attempts to control my newfound wealth. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if they knew about the money, it wouldn't bring pride or celebration. It would bring greed. The quiet arrangement I had with my own life was shattered by a phone call from my grandfather's lawyer. My grandfather, my mother's father, had been the only person in my family who had ever truly seen me. He was a quiet man, a carpenter who saw the world through the lens of craftsmanship and care. He'd look at my drawings and see the patience, not the lack of practicality. He'd listen to my ideas about technology and nod thoughtfully, even if he didn't fully understand. "You build worlds, Josie," he'd once told me, his voice raspy with age. "Just like I do. Different tools, same heart." His passing was a profound loss, a quiet severing of the one family tie that had ever felt unconditional. The lawyer informed me that my grandfather had left his entire estate, his house, his savings, his workshop, to me. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a significant inheritance, a final, loving gesture from the one man who had believed in my dreams. I knew, even as the lawyer spoke, that this would be the catalyst for the storm I had spent years avoiding. My parents and my brother would not stand for it. To them, this inheritance was not a gift to me, but a slight to them, a final, posthumous declaration that my grandfather had chosen the useless dreamer over his more successful family members. And I knew, with a sinking feeling, that they would do anything to take it from me. The courtroom, a place I had only ever seen on television, was about to become the stage for the final act of my family's long and painful drama. And my father, blinded by his own narrative, was about to hand me the victory on a silver platter. The reading of the will was as cold and sterile as I had anticipated. We sat in a stuffy, wood-paneled office, the air thick with the unspoken resentment of my family. My father, Gary, sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched. My mother, Lydia, wrung her hands in her lap, her eyes darting nervously between me and her husband. My brother, Harry, leaned back with a feigned nonchalance, but the tense tapping of his foot betrayed his agitation. When the lawyer read the clause stating that my grandfather's entire estate was left to me, Josephine, his beloved granddaughter and fellow builder of worlds, the silence in the room was deafening. It was a silence filled with a decade of my father's dismissive sighs, my brother's mocking laughter, and my mother's timid apologies. Harry was the first to break. "That's impossible," he said, his voice sharp. "Grandpa must have been confused. He was old. Joe probably manipulated him." My father nodded in grim agreement. "This is ridiculous. Josephine can barely manage her own finances. What's she going to do with a house and a portfolio? She'll squander it in a year on some artistic nonsense." I remained silent, my gaze fixed on the polished mahogany table. I had expected this, prepared for it. Their immediate assumption of my incompetence was as predictable as the sunrise. They couldn't conceive of a world where my grandfather had made a rational, deliberate choice. In their minds, it had to be a mistake, a product of senility or my own cunning manipulation. The days that followed were a carefully orchestrated campaign of pressure and guilt. My mother would call me, her voice trembling. "Josephine, your father is just trying to protect the family's legacy. He doesn't want to see your grandfather's hard work wasted. Can't you just be reasonable and share it with Harry? You know he would manage it so much better." My father was more direct. He cornered me after the funeral, his face a mask of paternal concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Listen, I've been thinking. Let me and Harry handle the estate for you. We'll invest it properly, make sure you get a small, manageable allowance. You won't have to worry about a thing. We all know you're not good with numbers." The offer was so insulting, so steeped in their lifelong perception of me, that I almost laughed. They weren't offering to help me, they were offering to take control, to absorb my inheritance into their own financial ecosystem under the guise of protecting me from myself. When I politely but firmly refused, their demeanor shifted from feigned concern to outright hostility. That's when the lawsuit arrived. It was a thick, intimidating packet of legal documents, accusing me of undue influence over my grandfather in his final years. They claimed I had isolated him from the family, preyed on his deteriorating mental state, and coerced him into changing his will. The lawsuit was a work of fiction, a twisted narrative woven from their own greed and prejudice. But it was a legal document, and it demanded a response. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. My family had money and connections. My father was a respected, if disliked, figure in the local business community. They could afford a team of aggressive lawyers who would have no qualms about painting me as a manipulative, destitute artist who had taken advantage of a vulnerable old man. That's when I called Samantha. Samantha was a force of nature disguised as a lawyer. I had met her through a Women in Tech networking group. She was sharp, incisive, and had a reputation for being a formidable litigator who specialized in complex estate disputes. When I laid out the situation for her in her sleek, modern office, she listened without interruption, her fingers steepled, her eyes never leaving my face. "So, their entire case," she said after I had finished, "is built on the premise that you are, and I quote your father, a useless dreamer who is financially incompetent and therefore must have cheated to get this inheritance." "That's the gist of it," I confirmed, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Samantha leaned forward, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "And they have no idea about your actual financial situation." "None," I said. "They think I live paycheck to paycheck in a rented apartment." "And you have the documentation to prove otherwise. The sale of the app, the investment portfolios, the bank statements." "Everything," I said. "I've been meticulous with my records." The smile on Samantha's face widened. "Josephine," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "this is not a lawsuit. This is a gift. Your family has spent your entire life building a cage for you based on their own perceptions. They've just handed us the key." Our strategy was simple. We would let them build their case. We would let them parade their witnesses, their character assassinations, their carefully constructed narrative of my incompetence. We would provide all the discovery they requested about my life before the sale of my company, feeding their confirmation bias. We would let them dig their own grave, convinced they were standing on solid ground. The discovery process was humiliating. Their lawyers deposed me for hours, asking condescending questions about my career, my finances, my relationship with my grandfather. I followed Samantha's instructions to the letter, answering truthfully but vaguely, never volunteering information, never revealing the ace I held up my sleeve. The most painful part was reading the affidavits from my own family. My father, in his sworn statement, described me as flighty and irresponsible, a person who lacked the basic financial acumen to manage. Meanwhile, Marcus started to uncover a pattern of financial mismanagement and desperation on my family's side that was truly shocking. My father, Gary, who had always projected an image of unassailable financial success, had made a series of disastrous investments after his forced retirement. He had chased high-risk stocks, sunk money into a friend's failed restaurant venture, and essentially bled his retirement accounts dry. He wasn't the savvy businessman he pretended to be. He was a gambler who had lost big and was desperate to recoup his losses. My brother, Harry, was in even worse shape. His success as a car salesman was a carefully constructed illusion. He was drowning in debt, living far beyond his means to maintain the appearance of the winner my father had always proclaimed him to be. He had leased a luxury car he couldn't afford, maxed out multiple credit cards on designer clothes and extravagant vacations, and had even taken out a high-interest personal loan to cover his mounting expenses. His life was a house of cards, and a strong gust of wind was coming. This inheritance wasn't just something they wanted, it was something they needed. They saw my grandfather's estate as a lifeline, a bailout for their own reckless financial decisions. Their motivation wasn't just greed, it was sheer, unadulterated desperation. This discovery shifted the emotional tenor of the case for me. It was no longer just about their perception of me as a failure. It was about their own hidden failures. The real bombshell, however, came from Marcus's investigation into my grandfather's finances in the years leading up to his death. He discovered that my grandfather, a man of simple means and meticulous habits, had been making regular, significant cash withdrawals from his account for years. The withdrawals were always for the same amount, always on the last Friday of the month, and they stopped abruptly about 3 years before he passed away. At first, we couldn't make sense of it. But then Marcus, in a stroke of investigative genius, cross-referenced the dates of the withdrawals with my brother Harry's bank statements. He found a corresponding cash deposit into Harry's account within 24 hours of every single withdrawal my grandfather made. The pattern was undeniable. For years, Harry had been systematically siphoning money from our grandfather, likely under the pretense of some fabricated emergency or investment opportunity. But it got worse. The withdrawals stopped on the exact same month my grandfather had a serious health scare, and I had flown home to help care for him. I had stayed for 2 weeks, organizing his bills, setting up online payments, and helping him get his affairs in order. It was during that visit that he must have realized what was happening. He never said a word to me, too proud or perhaps too ashamed to admit that his own grandson had been stealing from him. But after that visit, the money train for Harry stopped. And it was shortly after that he had his will officially redrafted by his lawyer, completely cutting out his daughter and grandson and leaving everything to me. This was the linchpin. This was the motive. Their lawsuit wasn't just about their perception of my incompetence. It was a desperate, vindictive act of retaliation. My grandfather had discovered their betrayal and had quietly, deliberately cut them out. They knew it, and this lawsuit was their attempt to rewrite history, to steal back what they had already lost through their own deceit. Armed with this evidence, Samantha's strategy became even more precise. We were no longer just on the defensive. We were preparing for a counteroffensive that would not only dismantle their case, but expose them for the frauds they truly were. Samantha prepared a series of pointed questions for their depositions, carefully worded to lead them into a web of their own lies. When she deposed Harry, she asked him about his financial relationship with our grandfather. He lied with a practiced ease, painting a picture of a doting grandson who would occasionally receive a small cash gift for his birthday or Christmas. When she presented him with the bank statements showing the regular, large deposits, he stammered, claiming they were repayments for personal loans he had given his grandfather, a laughable assertion given the state of his own finances. When she questioned my father, she asked him about his knowledge of my grandfather's financial affairs. He puffed out his chest and claimed to have managed his father-in-law's investments for years, another bald-faced lie designed to portray himself as the responsible patriarch. He was positioning himself as the rightful steward of the estate, the one who should have inherited it all along. They were arrogant, overconfident, and completely unaware that we knew the truth. They believed they were in control, that their narrative was the only one that mattered. They walked into every deposition, ever. Why legal filing, with the smug assurance of people who have never been held accountable for their actions? The paper trail Marcus had uncovered was more than just evidence. It was a testament to their character, a detailed map of their greed and deceit, and we were about to use it to lead them right off a cliff. While the paper trail provided the what, I knew my own expertise could uncover the how. My family saw me as a useless dreamer, but they had no idea that the very skills they mocked were about to become their undoing. As a UX designer, my job is to understand how people interact with technology, to see the invisible pathways and connections they leave behind. I decided to apply that same methodology to our case. Samantha was initially hesitant, concerned about the legalities of digital forensics. But I wasn't talking about hacking or anything illegal. I was talking about open-source intelligence, about piecing together the publicly available digital fragments of their lives to corroborate the financial evidence Marcus had unearthed. I started with Harry. His social media was a carefully curated shrine to a life he couldn't afford. There were photos of him on a yacht in the Caribbean, dated just 2 days after a significant cash deposit from my grandfather's account. There was a post boasting about his new, top-of-the-line golf clubs, purchased the same week my grandfather had supposedly repaid him a large sum of money. He was sloppy, arrogant, and his digital footprint told a story of reckless spending that directly contradicted his sworn testimony. I compiled every post, every geotag, every time-stamped photo into a detailed timeline, cross-referencing it with the financial records. It was a damning portrait of his deception. My father, Gary, was more careful. He didn't have much of a social media presence, but he had an email address and he had used it. I remembered an incident years ago when he had asked for my help setting up a new tablet. I had linked his personal email account to it, and to my surprise, he had never changed the password I set for him. It was a long shot and ethically murky, but Samantha, after consulting with a legal ethics expert, determined that if I had pre-existing, authorized access, it wasn't a breach. Logging into his email felt like a violation, but I justified it as a necessary evil. What I found was a digital confession booth. There were desperate emails to his stockbroker, pleading for extensions on margin calls. There were angry exchanges with the friend whose restaurant he had invested in, accusing him of fraud. And then there was the smoking gun, a string of emails between him and Harry, sent just days after my grandfather's will was read. "She won't budge," my father had written. "The little fool thinks she can manage it herself." Harry's reply was chillingly pragmatic. "Then we do what we discussed. We paint her as incompetent. We question Grandpa's state of mind. We make her look like a greedy, manipulative child. No judge will ever believe he left it all to her on purpose." In a later email, my father outlined the entire legal strategy, the plan to accuse me of undue influence, the narrative they would sell to the court. "We just need to stick to the story," he wrote. "She's the useless dreamer. We're the responsible ones. It's the only story that makes sense." I printed every single email, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and vindication. This was it. This was proof of their conspiracy, their premeditated attempt to defraud me and defame me. They had not only lied under oath, but they had colluded to do so, all documented in black and white. The final piece of the puzzle came from my grandfather's old computer, a dusty desktop tower that had been sitting in his study. I took it home, and using my knowledge of data recovery, I was able to access his old files. I found his financial spreadsheets, his meticulously kept records, but I also found a folder labeled Josie. Inside was every email I had ever sent him. He had saved them all. There were emails from college where I talked about my struggles and my small victories in my coding classes. There were links to my early design projects, my portfolio, my blog posts about the future of technology. And then I found the document that would seal their fate. It was a simple text file, dated 3 weeks after my visit to help him with his bills. It wasn't a formal document, but a sort of digital diary entry. In it, my grandfather wrote about his disappointment in Harry, his dawning realization that he had been played for a fool by his own grandson. He wrote about his pride in me, about how he had spent hours going through the links I had sent him, marveling at the worlds I was building. "They call her a dreamer," he wrote, "but she is the only one who has built something real and lasting. They see her as a failure, but she is the one who understands the future. The inheritance is not a reward. It is an investment in the only member of this family who deserves one." Tears streamed down my face as I read his words. It was a final gift, a validation from beyond the grave. It was his testimony, his voice, preserved in a simple text file that my family, in their technological ignorance, would have never thought to look for. I presented all of it to Samantha, the social media timeline, the incriminating emails, my grandfather's digital diary. She looked at the mountain of evidence, her expression a mixture of awe and grim satisfaction. "They've built their case on your supposed incompetence," she said, a steely edge to her voice. "They have no idea that your useless skills have just handed us the gun, the bullets, and a signed confession. The courtroom isn't ready for you, Josephine. You're not just going to win this case. You're going to obliterate them." The weeks leading up to the trial were a masterclass in strategic silence. Armed with our arsenal of evidence, the temptation was to fire a warning shot, to show our hand and perhaps force a settlement. But Samantha was adamant. "No," she said, her voice firm. "They've made their bed of lies. We're going to make them lie in it in front of a judge." Our official strategy remained one of passive compliance. We responded to their lawyers' requests, we filed the necessary paperwork, but we gave no hint of the storm that was coming. We let them believe they had us on the ropes. I could feel their confidence growing with each passing day. My mother would leave tearful, guilt-laden voicemails, begging me to do the right thing for the family and give up. Harry swaggered through his final deposition, smug and self-assured. My father, in a pre-trial mediation, looked me in the eye and said, "It's not too late to stop this, Josephine. Just admit you can't handle it, and we can make this all go away." The condescension was so thick I could have choked on it. Behind the scenes, however, our team was working relentlessly. Samantha spent her days drafting her examination questions, each one a carefully crafted scalpel designed to dissect their lies with surgical precision. She prepared the evidence for admission, organizing the emails, the bank statements, and the social media posts into a clear, undeniable narrative of deceit. My role was to prepare myself. Samantha put me through grueling mock cross-examinations. She hired another lawyer from her firm to play the part of the opposing counsel, and he was brutal. He called me a failure, a manipulator, a gold digger. He twisted my words, belittled my career, and attacked my character. The first few sessions left me shaken and in tears, but Samantha was relentless. "They will do this and worse," she warned. "You need to be ready. You need to detach, to see it for what it is, a tactic. Their only weapon is to make you seem small. We will not let them." Slowly, I learned. I learned to control my breathing, to keep my voice steady. I learned to answer only the question that was asked, to resist the urge to over-explain or defend myself. I learned to look the lawyer in the eye, my expression calm and unreadable. I was no longer the timid, approval-seeking daughter. I was a witness preparing her testimony, a client with an ironclad case. The useless dreamer was transforming into a quiet warrior. The most crucial part of our preparation was deciding how and when to deploy our bombshells. We couldn't just dump all the evidence at once. It had to be a slow, deliberate demolition. Samantha planned the trial like a 3-act play. Act 1 would be their case, where we would let them build their monument of lies as high as they could. Act 2 would be the cross-examination, where she would tear it all down, brick by brick. And Act 3? Act 3 would be my testimony, the final, devastating reveal. We made a critical decision not to introduce the evidence of my wealth during the initial phases of the trial. Their entire case rested on my supposed poverty and incompetence. We would let them hammer that point home, let them commit to it so completely that when the truth was revealed, the reversal would be all the more shocking. The day before the trial, Samantha and I met for one final review. The conference room was covered in documents, timelines, and flowcharts. It looked like a war room, and in many ways it was. "Are you ready?" she asked, her gaze serious. I took a deep breath. The anxiety was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But underneath it, there was something new, a sense of calm, of resolve. My family had created this situation. Their greed, their prejudice, their lifetime of belittling me had led us to this room. I wasn't the one on trial, not really. They were. "I'm ready," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Let them say what they want. We have the truth." Samantha nodded, a rare, genuine smile touching her lips. "They think they know who you are, Josephine. They've spent 30 years writing your story for you. Tomorrow, you get to tell them how it really ends." That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat in my quiet, minimalist apartment, the city lights twinkling outside my window. I thought about the 10-year-old girl with her clay figures, the 24-year-old with her fledgling app, the woman who had built a life in secret, shielding her success from the very people who should have been her biggest cheerleaders. I thought about my grandfather, his quiet encouragement, his final, unwavering act of faith in me. This wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. For years, I had allowed them to define me, to confine me to the role of the useless dreamer. I had accepted their narrative, even built a false life to accommodate it, but no more. The silence was about to be broken, and the truth, in all its devastating and liberating glory, was about to be heard. The courtroom was exactly as I had imagined, solemn, intimidating, and smelling faintly of old paper and floor polish. My family sat at the opposing table, a united front of simmering resentment. My father, Gary, looked stern and important in his ill-fitting suit. My brother, Harry, fidgeted with his tie, a bead of sweat on his upper lip. My mother, Lydia, just looked sad, a woman caught in a current she was too weak to fight. They wouldn't look at me. Their lawyer, a slick, overconfident man named Mr. Davies, opened the trial with a flourish. He painted a picture of me that was both devastating and entirely fictional. He described me as an aimless, financially illiterate artist who had preyed upon the affections of her aging grandfather. He presented my old bank statements as Exhibit A, showing the judge my modest income, my struggles to pay bills, my supposed inability to manage money. With each document, my family nodded in solemn agreement, their faces masks of righteous concern. Samantha's cross-examinations were a thing of beauty. She was calm, methodical, and utterly ruthless. When Harry was on the stand, she began gently, asking him about his close relationship with his grandfather. Harry, buoyed by confidence, eagerly embellished, speaking of their deep bond and mutual respect. Then, Samantha produced the bank statements, my grandfather's withdrawals and Harry's corresponding cash deposits. "Mr. Family Name," she said, her voice deceptively mild. "Can you explain to the court why, for over 5 years, your loving grandfather gave you precisely $2,000 in cash every single month?" Harry's face went pale. He stammered, falling back on his lie about repaying a loan. "A loan?" Samantha pressed. "Do you have any documentation for this loan? A contract, an email, a single text message?" He had nothing, of course. By the time Samantha was done, she had exposed him as a liar and a thief who had systematically drained the resources of an elderly man. He practically fled the witness stand, his confident facade shattered. My father's testimony was the centerpiece of their case. He was their star witness, the responsible patriarch who was only trying to protect his family's legacy from his incompetent daughter. He spoke with a deep, authoritative voice, detailing my failures, my lack of ambition, my inability to grasp the realities of the world. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the moment that would be seared into my memory forever. Mr. Davies, seeking to deliver the final, killing blow to my credibility, asked my father, "Mr. Family Name, in your opinion, is your daughter, Josephine, capable of managing a significant financial estate?" My father sighed, a heavy, performative sound full of paternal sorrow. He looked at me for the first time that day, his eyes full of pity. "My daughter," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "My daughter can't even pay her own bills. She's always been a useless dreamer." The words hung in the air, the culmination of a lifetime of dismissal. The judge, a stern, intelligent woman in her 60s, had been listening patiently all morning. But now she shifted in her seat. She looked at the financial documents Mr. Davies had presented, then she looked at me, then back at my father. "Mr. Family Name," the judge said, her voice cutting through the silence. Mr. Davies tried to interject, but she held up a hand, silencing him. She looked straight at my father. "You are testifying under oath that your daughter is financially destitute." She is, my father confirmed, puffing out his chest. She struggles. It's a sad truth, but it's the truth. The judge paused, letting the silence stretch. Then she turned to Samantha. Ms. Reed, your client's financial status seems to be the central pillar of the plaintiff's case. Do you have anything to rebut this assertion? Samantha stood up slowly. We do, Your Honor, she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that made everyone sit up a little straighter. But I think it would be more impactful if the witness herself addressed it. The judge nodded. Ms. Family Name, please take the stand. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked to the witness box. This was it. I sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the courtroom. I saw my father, my mother, my brother, all looking at me with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. They had no idea what was coming. Samantha approached. Josephine, she began, your father has just testified that you are, and I quote, a useless dreamer who can't even pay her own bills. Is that an accurate description of your current financial situation? No, I said, my voice quiet but firm. It is not. Could you please tell the court about your professional career over the past decade? And so I told them. I spoke about my first job at the tech startup. I spoke about the long hours, the hard work, the eventual acquisition. And then I spoke about my app, the passion project I had built in my spare time. I explained what it was, the problem it solved, and the community it had built. Mr. Davies was on his feet, objecting. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. We are here to discuss the management of the estate, not the witness's little hobbies. The judge overruled him. I'm finding this very relevant, Mr. Davies. Please continue, Ms. Family Name. And what became of this app, Josephine? Samantha asked, her eyes twinkling. I took a deep breath. I sold it, I said, 7 years ago. And for how much did you sell this little hobby? I stated the number, a number with 7 zeros after it. A collective gasp went through the small public gallery. Mr. Davies froze mid-objection, his mouth hanging open, but my eyes were on my family. My brother Harry looked like he had been punched in the stomach. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. But my father's face was a study in absolute shock. The color drained from his face, leaving a pasty, gray pallor. His smug, confident expression melted away, replaced by a look of utter, slack-jawed bewilderment. The judge, who had been handed a folder by Samantha just before I took the stand, was looking through it. She paused, looked up from the papers, and pinned my father with a steely gaze. Mr. Family Name, the judge said, her voice cold and sharp. According to these verified financial statements, your daughter hasn't just been paying her own bills for the last 10 years. She's been a millionaire for almost a decade. The entire room fell silent. You could have heard a pin drop. In that silence, the only sound was the shattering of my family's reality. My father's face, once pale, was now turning a blotchy red. He stared at me, his eyes filled not with pride, but with a dawning, horrified understanding. He hadn't just been wrong about me. He had been spectacularly, publicly, and humiliatingly wrong. And he had built his entire case, his entire identity as the wise patriarch, on a foundation that had just been turned to dust. The rest of the trial was a formality. After the revelation of my net worth, my father's testimony, and indeed their entire case, collapsed like a dying star. Samantha then methodically entered the rest of our evidence into the record. The emails between my father and brother proving their conspiracy to commit perjury were displayed on the courtroom monitors, their own words condemning them. My grandfather's digital diary entry was read aloud, his voice seemingly filling the room, a final, poignant testament to his true wishes. By the time Samantha rested our case, my family was in ruins. Their lawyer, Mr. Davies, looked shell-shocked, as if he himself had been a victim of his client's deception. He offered a weak, sputtering closing argument, but it was pointless. Everyone in the room KN. Yo, the truth. The judge's verdict was swift and brutal. She dismissed their lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they could never file it again. She found that they had filed a frivolous and malicious claim, and she ordered them to pay all of my legal fees, a sum that was not insignificant. But she didn't stop there. She excoriated my father and brother for their conduct, citing their brazen dishonesty and callous disregard for the truth. She announced she was referring their testimony to the district attorney's office for a potential perjury investigation. The finality of her words was absolute. My family sat stunned, their faces ashen. They had walked into that courtroom expecting to be vindicated, to be handed the inheritance they felt they were owed. They walked out facing financial ruin and possible criminal charges. I left the courthouse without speaking to them. There was nothing left to say. I saw my father being confronted by a furious Mr. Davies, my brother staring blankly at the wall, and my mother weeping quietly into a handkerchief. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of something, not pity, but a sort of hollow sadness for the family I could have had, the family they could have been. But it passed. They had made their choices, not just in that courtroom, but over a lifetime of dismissals and deceptions. In the months that followed, their lives unraveled completely. The legal fees bankrupted my father. They had to sell their house, the one I grew up in, the one filled with so many painful memories. My brother, facing a perjury charge and drowning in the debt he could no longer hide, was fired from his job. The last I heard, he was selling used cars at a small, struggling dealership 2 towns over. My mother, finally broken by the stress and humiliation, left my father. She now lives in a small apartment, working a full-time administrative job for the first time in her life. I never touched a dime of my grandfather's inheritance for myself. Instead, I used the entire estate to create a charitable foundation in his name. The grandfather's name, Foundation for Young Artisans and Innovators. It provides grants and mentorship to young people in the arts and tech fields, the dreamers who are so often told their passions are impractical. I sold my grandfather's house and used the proceeds to purchase and renovate a building downtown that now serves as a co-working space and gallery for the foundation's recipients. It's a place of creation, of collaboration, a place where no one is ever called a useless dreamer. My life is quiet, but it is my own. I still live in my minimalist apartment, I still love my job, I still find joy in the simple act of creating something new. The money, which I once hid as a shameful secret, is now a tool, a resource to build a legacy my grandfather would have been proud of. Sometimes I think about that moment in the courtroom, the look on my father's face when the silence fell. It wasn't a moment of triumphant revenge, not really. It was a moment of profound and painful clarity. It was the moment a lifetime of lies was consumed by a single, undeniable truth. They had built their world on a narrative of my failure, never realizing that I had been building my own world all along, in silence, on my own terms. And in the end, my world was the one that was real.